Hello everyone, and welcome back to Game Easy, Roll Good. Today we're going to take a first look at the monster manual. It is available on D&D Beyond for anyone who has pre-purchased the book. I actually received the book in the mail just yesterday as well. So what I did this whole week, as soon as it came out, is I started putting together a spreadsheet that contains every monster and every monster's stats, all the main stats. I don't include like all their individual features or anything like that, but all the good numbers. And so I wanted to kind of take some time to at least go over that. I'm not going to look at any specific monsters in this video, at least. I might save that for later videos because there are a couple rants at least that I want to go on about a few things, but I just kind of want to give a good like high level overview of kind of what the big changes are in the book. But before I get started with that, if you are a new viewer to this channel or a returning viewer and you haven't quite hit that subscribe button yet, please consider hitting that now or at some point during this video if you like what you see and you want to see more. We're going to cover a few topics such as the different species changes that have happened, changes to lair actions and legendary actions, the actual stats like what the saving throws look like, what resistances and vulnerabilities and immunities look like. Without further ado, let's go ahead and take a look at what the specie changes are. So as they mentioned in the preview video for the monster manual, there's been many monsters that have had their species adjusted. This mostly just affected non-human creatures that had the humanoid creature type. They now have a more specific typing. Most of these make sense. So we see that the Aarakocra is now elemental. Bugbear is now a fae of the goblinoid type. Gith are aberrations. Gnolls are fiends. Goblins are also fae. Hobgoblins also fae. Jackalware is a fiend. Kenku is a monstrosity. Kobold is a dragon type. Kuotoa is an aberration. Lizardfolk, elemental. Merfolk, elemental. Quaggoth is a monstrosity. The Sahuagin are fiends. Thrykreen are monstrosities. Troglodytes also monstrosities. Were creatures, werewolves, were-tigers, were-bears, were-boars, all monstrosities of the lycanthrope subvariety. And the Yuan-Ti are also monstrosities. I don't know if all Yuan-Ti were previously monstrosities. I did find one that was at least called humanoids. I just wanted to include that here as well. Again, most of these make sense. The Gith being aberrations kind of took me for a spin the first time I saw it, but it kind of makes sense if you consider that, aberrations are things that are sort of alien and kind of draw magic from within themselves, not relying on like the weave or anything like that. So basically anything from the astral plane and basically anything that relies on psionics has a good chance of being considered an aberration. So I guess in that way it makes sense. And then the second one that stood out to me was also the lizard folk being elementals. I think this one probably makes the least sense to me. One of the things that the monster manual includes in 2024 is that for every monster entry, they have a habitat that they're known to be from, and the lizard folk don't have one of the elemental planes listed in their habitat. So I thought that was a little weird that they're considered elementals but aren't native to any elemental planes. Not that they need to, but that would just help it stand out at least. I did say in the description that most lizard folk are humanoid, but that some have more deep attunement to the elements, and the two lizard folk stat blocks that are in the monster manual specifically are like very centered around elemental themes. Like there's like a geomancer and something else. I can't remember what the other one was. So maybe it's just those particular ones that are considered elementals, and then all other lizard folk would be humanoid. I don't really know what their intention was there, but I just that stood out to me. But pretty much everything else makes sense. Kenku technically being a monstrosity makes sense. The goblin varieties being fae makes sense. I wasn't aware that the Sahuagin were fiendish in nature. I'd have to actually look into their lore a little bit more, but if you have any insight about that, you can let me know down in the comments. So while there was a number of species changes from things that were once humanoid to more specific creature types, we want to also look at what was not included in this monster manual. So all of the player available species, the ones that were published at least in the player's handbook for 2024, don't have their own dedicated stat blocks for what a basic sort of NPC version of them looks like in the monster manual. The monster manual kind of changes some of the definitions of what we consider certain creature types. So it defines humanoid as a creature that is more defined by their profession or station rather than what kind of creature they actually are. Likewise, all humanoid stat blocks, regardless of anything, are considered neutral alignment. And within the monster manual, at least, they consider neutral basically as any alignment. So if something is neutral, that means you can make it lawful good, you can make it chaotic evil, you can make it chaotic neutral, you can make it lawful evil. It's not saying that species is only neutral aligned. So instead of having all these individual stat blocks for each kind of species of a humanoid variety, they included just sort of like general like profession stat blocks such as priest, knight, which is like a bodyguard like kind of sort of thing, mage, things like that. Pirate is another one of them. So they're all there, they're all very general. So then the idea would be that you take whatever species you want them to be and you put all their species traits onto that stat block to reflect that they are a half elf or a human or an orc even. There's no suggestion for which species traits to carry over into those stat blocks. Like if you wanted to have like an orc, mage or whatever, what orc traits do you carry over? I've seen that complaint about this change, although I would say just carry over all of them. I don't know why you would pick and choose unless you think it would adjust their CR, but I don't think any species trait is going to adjust a monster's CR by so much that you would need to actually adjust their CR. And of course, because of that, one of the sort of big I guess dramas, as you could call that, is that orcs are not included in the monster manual because they were published as a player available unplayable species in the 2024 Player's Handbook. A lot of people are kind of up in arms about that because they think it's sort of like some sort of erasure, I guess. But if anything, that kind of means that there are more orcs in the monster manual than there were before. You just have to put the orc features on those different stations. So you can have an orc priest, you can have an orc pirate, you can have an orc mage, you can have an orc knight. You can have any kind of orc that you want. You just need to put the orc features on these different stat blocks. So ultimately, I feel like this is going to allow for just a greater diversity of stat blocks for each sort of humanoid species type. Again, all of them don't have their own stat blocks in the new monster manual, but they have all these general stat blocks that you can just put that species features on, and then you have all these other different stat blocks that you technically didn't have before. So there's probably less legwork on behalf of the DM because they don't need to come up with what an orc pirate stat block would look like. They can just take the pirate stat block and put orc features on it. So in that way, there's just, again, a lot of different stat blocks that are now available that weren't before, just because you can create all those different species and stat block combinations. There's also been a number of changes to spellcasting, or at least maybe less changes, or that maybe weren't the changes that we were expecting. So there are not nearly as many spell-like features as I was expecting. It really felt like they were going that way within the more recent publications, where monsters had, instead of having Cone of Cold, they would have something else that basically works like Cone of Cold, but isn't casting a spell, so it wouldn't be counterable. And then likewise, a lot of these spellcasting stat blocks were pruned. I don't feel like that trend really carried over into the new monster manual, which is a positive thing. Also, the concept of innate spellcasting is no longer a thing. Creatures that had innate spellcasting basically meant that they didn't need to use components for their spells, which means that they couldn't be countered because they didn't have somatic, verbal, or even material components. All spellcasting in stat blocks is just called spellcasting, and it will specify in that description whether or not they need any certain components. And on that note, most creatures with the spellcasting feature in their stat block only ignore material components for their spells, but they would still need to use verbal and somatic components for their spells, which means all of their spells can be countered. The notable exceptions here are creatures that have sort of psionic power. That would be your Githyanki, Githzerai, Mind Flayers, and other similar, usually aberrations is where they fall under. It does say that they can cast their spells without any components. Likewise, creatures that don't have hands and or a mouth, if they also have spellcasting, their spellcasting feature will say that they don't require verbal and or somatic components, depending on what their anatomy is like. That's very rare within the monster manual, but there are a few versions of that. But even then, if they can ignore verbal components, but it still has a somatic component, then it can still be countered. Likewise, if it has a somatic component, but not a verbal component, it can still be countered as long as it has one of those. So out of the total 507 stat blocks that are in the monster manual, 103 of them have the spellcasting feature. However, that doesn't mean that there are only 103 creatures that do cast spells. Some creatures have the ability to cast certain spells as a bonus action or reaction, but they lack the specific spellcasting feature. And most of these features, surprisingly to me, because I thought these would be the spell-like features that aren't actually spells, but in most of these situations, they are just casting the spell. And in most of those situations, I believe, if I recall, they also do need to use components. I think there are some exceptions, but I think most of the time I saw that they just cast the spell and there's no exception for whether or not they need to use components. The one thing I will say is that I think many spells in the spellcasting features are mostly utility spells. These may be things that they aren't really casting in combat, or maybe are using outside of combat, or things like detect magic, non-detection. So if you're playing with the new 2024 stat blocks and a creature is casting a spell that is dangerous to you, you can probably feel pretty comfortable knowing that that's probably one of the only dangerous spells in their stat block, and you can feel pretty comfortable about countering that spell because that is one of the few that they have access to that could actually harm you. So overall, counterspell I think is very worthwhile still. DMs may still likely add extra spells to spellcasting stat blocks, so you might have more dangerous spells to worry about. Moving on to changes to legendary resists and actions and lair actions. So lair and lair actions have been sort of merged with the regional effects that were in the 2014 monster manual. Most of the lair effects are now passive and affect players when the legendary creature is not even around them. Again, these are sort of the regional effects. Some examples would be needing to make a saving throw in order to benefit from a long rest while you're within that region, having disadvantage on death saving throws while in that region. There's a bunch of different ones. Some of the lair effects or regional effects do give the legendary creature a special action that they can do while they are in their lair, but most of the time this isn't actually combat centric. One of the most common examples is that they can cast control weather to change the weather. Control weather is like a 10-minute casting time on its own, so that's not really something they're going to be doing in combat. The legendary creature is in their lair, they get one additional legendary resistance and one additional legendary action, so it might be useful to the parties now to actually try to lure the legendary creatures out of their lair, otherwise they're fighting a more dangerous creature. Fighting a creature in their lair does mean that they are worth more experience. They don't quite adjust the CR of the creature, but they adjust the experience as if they are a CR higher than they are. I think it's usually just like one CR higher is usually how it works out. Legendary actions overall have been pretty overhauled. They're much more offensive defensive and controlling in nature. There isn't really any instances of just weak legendary actions where it's like, oh, they take a legendary action to move up to their speed and then do nothing. There are legendary actions that do allow them to move, but it's then usually then move and then make an attack, or if it is make an attack, it's sometimes casting a powerful spell, or it's having a big control effect. Some of those actions are actually limited to once per round because they are more powerful. I also think that I noticed that there aren't any legendary actions that cost more than one action, at least within the monster manual. But overall, we can feel like legendary creatures are going to be a lot more dangerous even when it's not their turn. You know, some legendary actions were very dangerous, but now each of them, you know, maybe each individual legendary action isn't quite as powerful as some of the ones were before, because that power is now spread out among all of their legendary actions. But overall, I think that's going to create just a much more threatening and dynamic combat. And on a similar note for legendary actions, there was the changes to the Shape Change 9th level spell. Previously in 2014, it said that you couldn't use the legendary or lair actions of the creature that you turned into. However, that text has now been removed from the 2024 version of the spell. But because lair actions aren't really a thing anymore, you can't use those, and even if they had lair actions, they're not in their stat block, so you can't use them anyway. However, you can use their legendary actions. I would imagine that some of the old lair actions would have been moved into actual legendary actions, but I haven't really gone through and done a lot of one-to-one comparisons to see what is actually changed in certain creatures. Well, like I said, nothing here is really super transformative, but overall we can expect legendary creatures to feel a lot more deadly. And that danger isn't limited to just legendary creatures. I think a lot of even low-level monsters are now a lot more dangerous. When it comes to incoming damage, I did notice that more creatures seem to have mixed damage types. It seems to be a lot more common. Basically, once you reach CR3 and above, you'll run into more creatures who do like bludgeoning, slashing, or piercing, and then they'll also do like poison damage or necrotic damage or fire damage or lightning damage. They'll either have like one attack that deals like piercing and poison damage, or they'll have like one attack that does slashing damage, and then they'll have another attack that just does fire damage somehow. So overall, you can expect sort of a lot of different kinds of damage in earlier levels. You know, this is something that wasn't super uncommon, especially when you got into like the mid tier of the game, especially if you were fighting like demons and things like that had naturally other damage types associated with them. But even things like bandits and pirates and things like that, just common humanoid creature types, they also now have more mixed damage available to them, which is interesting. So again, like I said, I put a whole spreadsheet together, including all the stats. So I have a chart here on the side having the counts of every damage type, so we can see that. So unsurprisingly, you know, your piercing, slashing, and bludgeoning are at the top. I do think it's interesting that poison and necrotic are the most common after the physical damage types. You know, we might think like, oh, fire or something like that would be more common. Notably, also psychic and force show up more than acid, radiant, cold, lightning, and thunder. I thought that was very interesting. We would think that those damages would be much less common. So if you're wanting to play a barbarian, you might feel a little, I don't want to say nerfed, but you might be taking a little bit more damage than you used to, mainly because creatures, again, are dealing a lot more mixed damage. The non-physical damage, I think, is usually less in most cases. Like they're going to deal more physical damage and like do like a D4 or a D6 of like poison or necrotic or whatever damage. So it's not going to be a lot of extra damage that you're taking, but you might feel that, you know, certain damages or certain creatures that you would expect to resist all of their damage now have some extra damage that is getting snuck through. And while I did include this chart here just to kind of give us a high-level overview of what the representation of damage looks like, this isn't to say that you should use this chart to try to determine what kind of resistances you should use. Of course, if you're trying to build a character who has good defenses, you should be taking into consideration the kind of adventure or campaign that you're going into. Especially if it's a published module, you can kind of take some good guesses. Like if you're going into the Nine Hells, like into Baldur's Gate, Descent into Avernus, you probably want like fire, necrotic, and poison resistances. If you're going into Icewind Dale, you probably want cold resistance, that sort of thing. Again, this chart is just here to give us an illustration of what the representation looks like in the monster manual. So that's incoming damage to us as players, but what about the damage that we deal to them? How does that spread out? So if we're looking at the damage, vulnerability, resistance, and immunity to creatures in the monster manual, the first thing that we kind of notice is that immunity to bludgeoning, slashing, and piercing is completely removed. There's only 2 creatures in the entire monster manual who are immune to slashing damage, but otherwise all immunity to that base, you know, physical damage type completely gone. And the resistances that exist, for some of them, there might be a creature that is maybe resistant to one of the types of damage. For the creatures that are resistant to all bludgeoning, slashing, and piercing damage, that's mostly going to be your ethereal type creatures like your ghosts, as well as your swarms of creatures who have blanket resistance to bludgeoning, slashing, and piercing. That is a huge buff to martial characters because for the most part, none of their attacks are ever going to be resisted, except in very predictable circumstances. You know, I think myself and many of us thought, based on the class changes where we saw that many martial characters had the ability to to change their weapon type to a certain elemental damage type. We thought that that would be the new, magic weapon damage to overcome resistances and immunities. And while that still is the case, they can use it in situations where that does come up. If your DM is just using the new stat blocks, they're really not going to run into that very often. So not only is that a huge buff to martial characters, but that is also a huge buff to certain spells that had bludgeoning, slashing, and piercing damage associated with them. They weren't in themselves magical. This would be spells like animate objects, for example. The damage dealt by them wasn't inherently magical. Using polymorph offensively, if you turn someone into a T-Rex, the attacks from that T-Rex weren't inherently magical either. So they would always have this problem where if that creature was immune to bludgeoning, slashing, and piercing from non-magical attacks, that they wouldn't be able to bypass that immunity. But now that's just not the case. So animate objects is even better now. Using polymorph offensively is even better now because you can use those big chunky attacks from things like a T-Rex. So overall, we can really be expecting to do a lot more damage of this damage type. So that's really exciting. There's probably more situations where that's going to be a huge boon to us as players to be able to do more damage. I don't have any examples in my head, but I'm sure things will come up. On the other hand of that, we can see that poison still has a problem with the fact that it has such a disproportionate number of immunities to resistances. It isn't the only damage type that has more immunities than resistances, but it is the only damage type that has such a huge gap between resistances and immunities. We can see 9 resistances and 118 immunities across the whole monster manual. So of course we had things like the poison or feat where you could ignore resistance to poison damage. That affects literally 9 creatures in the entire monster manual, and it does nothing against the other 118 who are immune to poison. Likewise, there was the changes to the assassin rogue, who is more built around dealing poison damage now, who just can't deal damage to 1/5 of the creatures in the monster manual. Notably, the poison immunity is still centered on very specific creature types, that being your undead, elementals, constructs, and green dragons, of course. So in that way, it's very predictable when you won't be able to do that poison damage, but still just sort of a really weird interaction that I felt like they were going to address with the changes to assassin and poison damage in general, with it feeling a little bit more prevalent. I thought that maybe that, instead of having immunity to both, if something was immune to the poison condition, maybe it would have resistance to poison damage more frequently. And then maybe in the most extreme cases, for the more powerful creatures, they would have immunity to both. But they really didn't do that at all. So that's a little disappointing to me. It is only certain creature types. I didn't include fiends down here, but specifically of the devil and demon and Yugoloth variety, they typically have immunity to poison as well. Basically, if you're going into Curse of Strahd, you probably don't want to play a poison-centric class. If you're going into Descent into Avernus, you probably don't want to play a poison-centric class. So if you want to play around poisons, you really need to kind of gauge what adventure you're going into and whether or not it will be effective. Lastly, I want to cover a brief overview of saving throws. So I have 3 charts here. The one on the far left is the 2024 Monster Manual. This is the average saving throw by CR. The one in the middle is pre-2024 saving throws. And then the heat map on the right is the change. So if it is a red number, that means that the average seemed to have increased. If it is a green number, the average seemed to decrease. And then if it's yellow, then there's no change. There are a couple things to mention is that, number one, not every monster in the 2014 Monster Manual is in the 2024 Monster Manual. So there are some differences there. The spreadsheet that I'm using that has the pre-2024 monster stats includes some of the later publications monsters. So things like from Morning Canaans or maybe even Van Richten's Guide to Ravenloft, I think is also in there. It's not every monster that existed pre-2024, but it's a lot of them. There's an extra 200-ish creatures in that spreadsheet compared to the 2024 Monster Manual. So that's basically pulling from a larger sample size that might factor into the differences in the averages here. Not only that, but of course in higher CRs where there are just fewer creatures at that CR, big changes to one creature are going to create big changes. For example, if there's one creature, for example, like the Tarask in 2024 has a +9 to their dexterity saving throw, whereas in pre-2024 they didn't have any bonus to their dexterity saving throw. So things like that are going to create bigger swings than we maybe have thought, and of course that'll have a higher impact on the averages. All that is to say, at least based on the data that we have here, we can see that dexterity saves seem to have been increased noticeably across the board. Charisma saves, on the other hand, have been noticeably lower across the board. There are small increases to strength and wisdom saving throws, but then small decreases to constitution and intelligence saving throws. And I think one thing that's interesting to notice here is that at least for con, intelligence, and charisma, it seems like the later that you get in the levels, the more fluctuation that you see. And again, that may be just a product of not having the full monster roster to pull from in 5th edition, but I just think that's kind of a really interesting pattern to see that the mental saves kind of get worse, at least for intelligence and charisma, the higher levels you go. And in Constitution as well. Again, Constitution was one of those stats that we've always said is one of the best stats for monsters. And it seems like the game designers more or less took that information and maybe toned things down a bit. So things like concentration checks, Counterspell, for example, would get buffed by this because it's a Constitution saving throw now. All those spells that we felt were worse because they are Constitution saving throws are now potentially a little bit stronger because of these changes. So that is everything I wanted to cover in this video about the monster manual. I might focus on specific monster types and things like that in future videos. If there's anything specific that you want to see or hear about the monster manual, definitely let me know down in those comments. I will have a link to the Google Doc that contains all the base data in the description down below as well. So you can go to that Google Sheet, download it, and kind of pull whatever information you want from it. It's not the cleanest spreadsheet. There are probably things I want to change about it, but I wanted to at least get this information out to all of you. So you can let me know everything that you think about all the changes that we covered in this video down in the comments below. And again, while you're going down in those comments, please hit that like button. If you are a new viewer or returning viewer to this channel and you like what you saw here and you want to see more from me, please consider hitting that subscribe button. It helps me out quite a bit. I release videos every Wednesday and Sunday, so you always have something to look forward to. I appreciate all your time, and I'll see you in the next one.